So, brothers and sisters, today we will talk about the desert as a place of purification. Uh, Usually, we associate the word desert with death. In fact, the desert is a place of extreme scarcity. We see death in desert. Life conditions are not good, are not very good in the desert. This is the picture we usually have of the desert. However, this doesn't mean that there is no life in the desert. By the way, I'm not sure if you know that, but it's in the desert that we can see some of the most beautiful flowers in the cactus of the desert. Today, we will see how the desert can be a place where we find life and beauty. Not only a place of death, but also a place of life. And in the entire Bible, nobody can talk about the desert experience better than Moses. As you know, he spent 2/3 of his entire life in the wilderness. 80 years in the desert. 80 years in the desert. We can easily understand Moses' life in three 40-year periods. It's very clear in the Bible. From the basket on the Nile River to the day when he fled from Egypt, 40 years. Moses in Egypt as the prince of Egypt. Then we have the next 40-year period. Moses as an exile in the wilderness, in Midian. This time, we preached about this time 2 weeks ago. It was the desert of Moses. And then we have the burning bush when Moses met with God. Moses heard the voice of God. And then we have the Exodus. And then 40 years, Moses leading Israel through the desert. So we have 3 40-year periods. Moses, I don't know if you know that, but when Moses led Israel through the desert, he was 80 years old. 80 years old. He started his mission. And then, at the end of this period, in the border of the promised land, Moses is probably around 120 years old. He is talking to Israel. And then we have this special book called Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy brings the words of Moses to the new generation of Hebrews, right before they enter the promised land. Deuteronomy is kind of a book of the border. Why? Because it makes the transition between the desert and the promised land. So, the last words of Moses in the desert to the new generation, we see these words in Deuteronomy. And it's very interesting because Deuteronomy, as this book of the border, in this book, we have a look back to the desert, to these 40 years in the desert, and we have a look ahead. Moses is looking to the past, and Moses is looking ahead to the promised land. He talks about tribulation, and he talks about prosperity. And the perspective that Moses brings in this book is very extraordinary. As we will see right now in Deuteronomy chapter 8, the perspective is very different. Maybe if we are talking about this time, in this situation, in this border between the desert and the promised land, we should write in a different way. But let's see what Moses said to these people, to this new generation. Today we will read Deuteronomy chapter 8, and we invited Moses himself to read to us this text today, right? You will understand why I'm talking that. Probably Moses was 120 years old when he said these words to the Hebrews. So let's see and hear Moses talking these words to us today. Okay?
Every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe, that you may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land of which the Lord swore to your fathers. And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. Your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell these 40 years. You should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you. Therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs that flow out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. When you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built beautiful houses, and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness, in which were fiery serpents and scorpions, and thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you, and that he might test you, to do you good in the end. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. And you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. Then it shall be, if you by any means forget the Lord your God, and follow other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish. As the nations which the Lord destroys before you, so you shall perish, because you would not be obedient to the voice of the Lord your God.
It's very interesting because when Moses looks back to the wilderness, to the desert, to the scarcity, he sees that as in a very positive way. He sees the desert as an opportunity. He sees with joy, gratitude, and he sees the desert as a blessing. But when Moses looks ahead to the promised land, to the prosperity, he sees the prosperity as a danger. He sees with concerns. There's a warning. And we can almost say that there is a curse in the prosperity. And this is a very, very different way that we usually to see things today. Because we see the desert as a bad place, as a curse. And we see the prosperity as blessing. But Moses thinks in a different way. I think it was Teresa of Avila that once said that dealing with honors, delights, and pleasures is like walking among lions. It's interesting that it's a very different way. And today, I'd like to talk about the blessings in the desert and the dangers of prosperity. It's a very different perspective, but it's biblical. So first, let's talk about the blessings of the desert. The blessings in the desert. The text says at least 5 things, 5 blessings in the desert. Take a look at verse 2. Moses says, "The Lord your God led you all the way." Guidance. Then he humbled you. In the desert, we are humbled. We become people with this very virtuous characteristic, humbleness. Then the text says, to humble you and test you. In the desert, we have a self-evaluation. And I think about the times we are living today, all this pandemic. And what if we understand all this situation we are living right now as a test? Are we being tested in this desert that we are living today? Are we being approved? Then the text says, allowed you to hunger and fed you with manna. In the desert, we experience the provision of our God. He is the one who feeds us. And then the Lord your God chastens you. We have the discipline. So all these things are positive, are things for our good, are blessings in the desert. We have a very interesting quote from J.I. Packer talking about the place of suffering in our process of sanctification. He says, the New Testament shows us that in the school of sanctification, many modes of pain have their place. Physical and mental discomfort and pressure, personal disappointment, restriction, hurt, and distress. God uses these things to activate the supernatural power that is at work in believers, to replace self-reliance with total trust in the Lord who gives strength, and to carry on His holy work of changing us from what we naturally are into Jesus' moral likeness with ever-increasing glory. Thus, He prepares us for that which He has prepared for us. Take a look that the desert is a blessing. I'm not sure if you are in a desert today. But let me say something. If you are, the word of God for you today is, you are blessed. In this story, we can say that first, God brought the Hebrews out of Egypt, salvation. But then God brought Egypt out of the Hebrews. And this is the process J.I. Packer calls sanctification. God is the one who saves us and then sanctifies us. The desert is the ideal place for that. The desert is the place where God purifies us. And how does He do that? How does God purify us in the desert? In this text, we can talk about 4 actions of God in this process. First, removing our basic goods. The text says, He allowed you to hunger. The desert is a place of deprivation. In the desert, we are incapable of providing for ourselves. In the desert, we see how fragile we are. And it's not an absurd to say that we have been living in a desert since last year. All this time is a time of the deprivation. It's a time where God is removing, in some way, our basic goods. A time of restrictions. And the desert is this time. And it's necessary. Why? Why is this necessary? In this process of purification and sanctification. Because the second action, we see here God revealing our counterfeit gods. The text says that God humbles us to test us, to know what was in your heart, He says to the people of Israel. And why is that? Think with me. When we lose things, people, and circumstances that we love, we discover how dependent we were from those things. In other words, the way we react when we lose things and people reveals if these things and people were idols, were ultimate things in our lives. How do we react when we lose a job, for example? As I said, we live today times of restrictions. We lose things. How do we react? How are we dealing with this? How does this reaction reveal about us, about our idols? The desert reveals the things that control us. And then God removes these things to reveal to us that many times we trust more in these things than in God Himself. Sometimes we need to lose everything to realize and value what is really important. This is why the desert is a purification time. Because we know in the desert, we recognize in the desert our own idols. And then there is a third action when God eliminates our compulsions. When God teaches us how to live without these basic goods. This is the process of mortification of the flesh, where God frees us from our own compulsions, obsessions, idols. There's a picture here with many of modern compulsions that enslaved us. And you need to know that there is no freedom without pain. So God removes our basic goods to reveal our counterfeit gods and to eliminate our compulsions. And then the fourth action is when God trains our reliance and trust in Him. It's very interesting how the text talks about that. He humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna. Pay attention that God humbles us in two ways here. The first way, as I said, God removes our basic goods. But also, when God feeds us to teach us that we depend on Him. When God feeds us, we learn that we are incapable to provide for ourselves. We need to be humble to accept the provision of our God. I remember when Jesus washed the feet of His disciples, Simon Peter was still too proud to let Jesus wash his feet. Some people are too proud to be washed. Some people are too proud to be fed. They say, no, it depends on me. I am my provider. I need to work. I need to make things happen. And then God removes our basic goods to reveal our idols, to kill our compulsions, and to teach us that we depend on Him. It's interesting how the text says, verse 3, He did it to teach you that people do not live by bread alone. Rather, we live by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. In the desert, God destroys our idols to help us understand that He is the most precious and important thing in our lives. We experience hunger, insecurity, and vulnerability to understand where our true provision and security comes from. In the desert, we learn to love God more than the gifts we receive from God. It's easy for us to cling to the gifts and to forget God Himself. We learn in the desert to trust in God and distrust ourselves. So, the desert is a blessing, right? Moses is clearly talking about that. In verse 16, he will say that God did all these things and God led the people through the desert for your own good. The desert is for our good. Believe it or not, it is. It's interesting how the prophets in the Old Testament talked about the desert. Through the prophet Hosea, God said, I will lead her. And her here is the nation of Israel, like an unfaithful woman. And God says, I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her there. God led his people to the desert to talk tenderly, to speak tenderly to her there. And Jeremiah 31 verse 2, the people who survived the sword in Egypt found grace in the wilderness. Take a look at the wilderness, the desert, is a place of grace. It's not a curse, it's a place of mercy. So, the first great lesson today, to you understand, if you are in a desert, it doesn't mean that God doesn't love you or has forgotten you. It's very important to understand that. In the desert, God refines us and burns our idols. Many times, God doesn't deliver us from the desert, but in and through the desert. So, there are many blessings in the desert. If you are in the desert, I encourage you to pray and to see and to think about how this time is a blessing of God in your life. How God is refining you in this time of desert. But then, pay attention that, as we said, there are blessings in the desert, but also there are dangers in prosperity. And Moses talks about that, and just to finish here, he talks about at least 3 dangers in of the prosperity. Verse 11, be aware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command you today. The first great danger of prosperity is forgetting the Lord. It's easier to forget the Lord in the promised land than in the desert. So, if you are prospering, if you are in a very good shape, I warn you, you are in a very vulnerable situation. When you see churches around the world, sometimes we talk here about the persecuted church, but what we understand is that many times the church is under strong persecution. Churches with many restrictions are the churches that are in better condition, spiritually talking. We have this comfort zone, and this comfort zone can lead us to forget the Lord. So there's this great danger. The second danger, verses 12 to 14. Last, when you have eaten and are full and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up. So, there is a second danger, and this danger is pride. in prosperity, we can be proud. And this is very bad, because when we are proud, we are in a opposition to God. The Bible says that God resists the proud. And it's very bad when we allow our heart to be proud. And the third danger here, verse 17. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. So, self-sufficiency. And Moses is talking to his people, and he's saying, first, remember the past. Be thankful for the desert. The desert was a blessing in your lives. Even you faced loss, and you faced all kinds of restrictions and scarcity. It was a blessing to you. But now you are entering the good land, the promised land. And be aware, because there are many dangers there. And the three biggest dangers are forgetting the Lord, pride, and self-sufficiency. As I said, the Bible talks a lot about deserts and about prosperity. Do you remember what the Apostle Paul said about prosperity? 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9. People who long to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many foolish and harmful desires that plunge them into ruin and destruction. There's a big risk in prosperity. Pay attention when you are prospering. Be aware when you receive a promotion in your job, when things are very good, because this is a very dangerous place. It doesn't mean that God doesn't want that to you. Many times, He's so good and He allows us to be rich, to be in a very good shape. But be aware, do not forget the Lord. J.I. Packer wrote a book called Hot Tub Religion. And it's interesting because we live in a society addicted to welfare. In this context, many times and in many ways, religion has become nothing more than entertainment. There's a huge difference between us and Christians from other times and cultures. Historically, the church was always a group of believers that exist to serve the world and glorify God. A group of disciples. As a church, historically, we can say that we don't exist to please, but to transform. However, there are many who believe that we go to church just to have an inspiring, emotional, and relaxing experience. And J.I. Packer describes this kind of thinking as a hot tub religion. Think about a hot tub. Delicious, right? What a blessing, a hot tub, right? Relaxing. You forget all your problems in a hot tub. But his thesis in this book is that Christianity has been corrupted by the passion for pleasure. Many times we expect a church like a hot tub, just to relax. We go there because we need to be relaxed. And there are symptoms of this kind of thinking nowadays. Take a look what J.I. Packer says about these symptoms, and I'd like to finish with that. Symptoms of hot tub religion today include a skyrocketing divorce and remarriage rate among Christians, widespread indulgence in sexual aberrations, and overheated supernaturalism that seeks signs, wonders, visions, prophecies, and miracles. Constant soothing syrup from electronic preachers and the liberal pulpit. Anti-intellectual sentimentalism and emotional highs deliberately cultivated the Christian equivalent of cannabis and coca, and uneasy, thoughtless acceptance of luxury in everyday living. These are not healthy trends. They make the church look like the world, driven by same unreasoning desire for pleasure, seasoned with magic. What J.I. Packer is talking here is not what many of his critics can call asceticism, or like the thinking that we can't be joyful. We can't have joy or happiness. No. But there's a problem when we are addicted to welfare, when we can't face adversity. And the second great lesson today is that the Christian faith is not a religion to help you escape suffering, but to train you to obey and honor God in any circumstance. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, there are two words. There are two key words. The first one is remember. Remember the desert and be thankful. And the second word is be aware and obey the commandments of your Lord. When you remember the past, the adversity, the desert, be thankful. And when you go to the promised land, be aware. Don't forget the Lord and obey the Lord. The Christian faith is not a religion to help you escape suffering, but to train you to obey and honor God in any circumstance. 3 questions to you, and we will pray together. Number 1, what does it mean to be blessed? How do you face adversity and prosperity? How do you understand the word blessing? Second question, what kind of relation do you have with God? Is He a means or the end? You need God to receive things, to have things, to reach things that are beyond God, or Do you need God by God Himself? This is the point in Deuteronomy. And the third question, do you see the church as a training community or just as a relaxing community? We need to understand, hearing Moses here, that the church should be a training community, a place where we learn how to live, honoring God, obeying God, walking through the desert. We are training, we are being trained, we are being tested. God is feeding us in the desert, that we understand, that we may understand that He is the most important thing in our lives and in our church. My desire is that during this desert time that we are walking through right now, we may be approved, and that we go to the promised land, but in a total dependence on Him. Let's pray together to finish.